Today, we dive into a document that raises a really uncomfortable question. Why do we keep canceling trips based on the risk of an entire country when the real tangible threats are often hidden not just at the city level, but sometimes at the neighborhood and even the block level?
It's this massive disconnect, right, between how we're told to see risk and where the danger actually is.
And that points to a fundamental flaw in how so many of us and so many organizations approach travel security. Welcome to a new deep dive from Strategic Labs. We're going to unpack this whole issue and explore a much smarter way to think about risk. And as always, you can find the original links right there in the description.
So, here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to start by looking at the flaw in our maps, this big macro view. Then we'll zoom into the city-level reality and then get even more granular with the microgeography of risk. After that, we'll talk about how to turn all that noise into a clear signal. And finally, we'll wrap up by talking about how this is really a shared responsibility.
All right, let's tackle this first big problem. We tend to look at travel risk with this super wide-angle lens, and that creates some pretty serious blind spots. Before we go any further, let's make sure we're on the same page. When we talk about destination intelligence, we're not just talking about collecting a bunch of data. No, it's a whole process. It's about analyzing and really interpreting that information to build a realistic, practical understanding of where you're actually going.
And this quote from the source material, man, it just hits the nail on the head. When we slap a single high-risk label on an entire country, we're not actually being safer. We're just oversimplifying things in a way that leads to really poor, uninformed decisions. It just starves our judgment. And this slide really breaks down the two massive mistakes that come from that oversimplification. On one hand, you get risk inflation. That's when some scary headline makes you cancel a trip that would have been totally fine, and boom, missed opportunity. But on the other hand, you have risk deflation. That's when a safe country label makes you let your guard down and you wander right into a localized hotspot. Honestly, both are just as dangerous.
So what's the answer? Well, we have to start zooming in. Let's move down to our first crucial level of focus, the city itself.
This is such a key contradiction to understand. You could have a country that's dealing with a ton of instability, but its capital city is a complete bubble of security and order. And the reverse is also true. You could have a super stable, low-risk country that has one or two cities with very specific problems. Things like local governance, infrastructure, and policing. They create their own unique risk maps that are often totally separate from the national picture.
But we can't stop at the city level. To really get a handle on risk, we have to get even more granular. We've got to look at what the source calls the microgeography, the block-by-block reality of a place. This quote right here makes it personal and it makes it urgent. Just think about it for a second. You could be in a well-lit, totally secure business district, feeling perfectly safe, while just a couple of streets over it, the situation is completely different. And this isn't some rare exception. This is the reality in so many cities all over the world. See, this is the level where abstract risk becomes a real, tangible threat. Things like socioeconomic divides, the physical layout of the city, and the simple presence or absence of good policing. They create these sharp, invisible borders. And ignoring these micro-level details is probably one of the most common and most avoidable mistakes in travel planning.
Okay, so we get it. Risk exists in layers. But what do we do with that knowledge? How do we act on it? This is where we shift gears and talk about interpreting information correctly, about separating that useful signal from all the distracting noise.
So let's say a travel alert pops up. The first instinct might be to panic. Don't. You've got to process it. First, who sent it? A government advisory has a different weight than a local news report. Second, what's the scale? Is this a warning for the whole country, or is it about a protest in one specific plaza you weren't even going near? Third, validate. Can you cross-reference this with local contacts or other intelligence sources? And finally, this is the most important step. Think adjust, not cancel. Maybe it just means you take a different route, or move a meeting, or pick a different hotel. You don't always have to scrap the whole trip.
Because really, the goal here isn't to be constantly paranoid. It's about getting to this productive middle ground, a state of what you could call informed alertness. You're aware, you're prepared, you're adaptable, but you're not crippled by anxiety. That's the sweet spot where you can still be effective. And all of this leads us to our final section, because achieving that state of informed alertness, well, it's not a one-person job. It's absolutely a shared responsibility between the traveler and their organization.
So let's start with the traveler's role. You're not just a passenger on this trip. You are an active part of your own security. This means doing your homework,
using that critical thinking when you get an alert, and making smart, on-the-ground adjustments. And just as important, you become a source of intelligence yourself. You're the sensor on the ground, and feeding what you see back to your organization helps keep everyone safer.
At the same time, the organization has a huge duty of care here. They need to provide intelligence that's actually useful, not just some generic warning, but specific, actionable advice that's tailored to your actual itinerary. They've got to train their people, provide the right tools, and make sure that if a traveler needs help, that 24/7 support is real, it's coordinated, and it's effective.
Because in the end, that's what this is all about. Effective travel security is a partnership. It's a continuous dialogue between a well-informed traveler and a supportive organization. It's about moving away from this one-way street of top-down rules to a two-way exchange of information, context, and trust. We have reached the end of this extensive analysis. If it added value, share and subscribe to Strategic Labs. See you next time.